Chairperson, thank you for taking the time for Fox 5. We wanted to start at the very beginning. How did you find out about the tragedy?
I had just gotten home in Fredericksburg, and my first call actually came from somebody I knew at the Federal Aviation Administration. And he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "I just walked in the door." And he said, "Don't ask me any questions. Pack up your go bag and head back to DC."
So you pack up your go bag, you head back to DC. Where do you wind up? What's the first thing you do?
So there is a time after any accident where the focus is on search and rescue or search and recovery. And in this case, as we do in most cases, we stand back and let the emergency responders do what they need to do. So the first person on scene is usually our special operations chief, who then contacts us. He's the liaison for all the response agencies, and then he'll contact us and tell us when to come over so that we're not in the way.
A lot of people in the Washington area will remember the Air Florida disaster. And to have NTSB here in Washington, where literally you could go on the roof of the building we're on right now and see the crash site, were you in a position to flood the zone, get more elements of investigative apparatus out there because of your location to the crash site?
Yeah, so that did help us. We were able to get there very quickly. We had a lot of our team in town. Certainly we had to bring some from out of town here, specialists in certain areas. But then we also have our materials lab and our recorders lab right here in DC, so that helps us get the evidence to our lab very quickly.
So a lot of people remember that night. It was dark. It was cold. You get there. What's the first thing you see?
So the first thing that we did is we went to one of the command trailers where many of the response agencies were coming together. And it was a sea of lights, just flashing lights, flashing red lights. And we were towards the end of runway 33, so we were in one of the trailers getting a briefing on what was going on at that time. It was within an hour of the collision.
How quickly did you start putting together the pieces of what had happened?
At the very beginning, it was within days that we start getting pieces of information, and it's everything from interviews that we're conducting, information that we may be getting from the cockpit voice recorder, the flight data recorder. It did take a little longer with those. Or it's wreckage that we're bringing in. That does take time. But we are spending that time while the wreckage is being recovered, gathering information, getting together with the Army and the Federal Aviation Administration, PSA Airlines, and others to figure out how this occurred.
The morning after the disaster, you stood in front of a packed press conference at Reagan National Airport. I was in that crowd. What I'd asked you that morning was how difficult it was conducting this investigation on the water the way you were at that time. You look back on it now, how difficult was that environment to operate in?
It's not unusual for the NTSB. We have done a number of investigations where we have submerged aircraft or submerged wreckage. I was on a barge a few years ago for about a week in Mutiny Bay, Washington, where we were looking for float plane wreckage, and that was, very deep water, very difficult conditions, tough current, so very different. In this case, it was somewhat shallow. I think making sure there were measures in place to be respectful of the families of the victims in the recovery process.
That same morning, Todd Edmond, who was one of your colleagues, he stepped to the mic and he got kind of emotional in that moment when he said that his heart and everyone's was filled with sorrow about everything that was affected around us and that there were a lot of people hurting that day. We could see on all of your faces the emotion of that day. How do you set that aside when you have to conduct the kind of work that you have to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I will say I have never seen a team so dedicated to the mission, and the focus is very much on the investigation and putting the story together of what occurred here, gathering the evidence. So it's very mission oriented. With that said, we are all human, of course. We go to the family briefings, but there are also resources for our investigators. There were therapy dogs that came into the hangar. We have that many times on scene. We have an employee assistance program available. I think it affects people differently. For me, of course it affects me, but I also know that I have to do what we do at the NTSB, so I am very focused on that mission. When it hits me is afterwards, when things get quiet. So that was towards the end of when we were on scene.
Unfortunately, things didn't get quiet for all of you. It was immediately followed by the helicopter crash in Philadelphia. We've had other disasters. Of course, people remember the UPS disaster. You had at NTSB an unprecedented year last night. What was that workload like, and how have you been able to deal with all of these different investigations that you've been responsible for?
It's a substantial workload. We have over 2,000 cases that we're managing a year. It's usually about 1,400 new ones every year and some that carry over. But last year, it was within days of the tragedy near the mid-air collision. We had Philadelphia, as you mentioned. We had Nome, Alaska. Then New York helicopter. We had UPS. We were still finishing the Dolly. It's a lot of work. We have a pretty talented team. I don't think people know that we only have about 420 employees to do what we do. So it is a lot of work. Fortunately, we have gotten a lot of support for increasing our numbers, which also brings down the caseload for individual investigators so that they can do what they do in a more timely fashion.
I'm sure you heard the talk. Immediately after all of those events, people started saying things like, what is going on? Why is all of this happening? Mm-hmm. Can you assure people now that the American air transport system is in a safe place?
Absolutely. The safest way to travel is by air. It was 3 or 4 weeks after the mid-air collision. I was on the same plane, the same operator, with my daughter, flying her to Georgia to go see colleges in Georgia and Alabama. So when I talk a lot about driving, 43,000 people die every year driving on our nation's roads. That is substantial. That's actually your bigger risk, is going to and from the airport. Aviation is incredibly safe. Do we have to make some safety improvements, though? Yes, we do. And we have nearly 300 safety recommendations that still need to be implemented in aviation that could prevent the next tragedy.
In investigating the Potomac disaster, you released preliminary findings from the NTSB back on March 11th. What were those findings able to implement immediately in regards to improving the air safety around DCA?
Well, within hours, thankfully, the Secretary took action and stopped the mix of traffic of helicopters and civilian aircraft. I mean, the biggest thing we found, which was incredible to us, is we mapped out, our very talented researching and engineering team mapped out the glide slope, which is how the planes come in to runway 33, and they mapped out a helicopter that is allowed to travel down helicopter Route 4 at a max altitude of 200 feet. And we realized at best there was only 75 feet of vertical separation between a helicopter going down Route 4 and a plane landing at 3-3, and that diminishes as you come out from the bank on the Potomac River, and as the plane comes down into runway 33. The other thing we found is that there was evidence to suggest there was a real problem. There were 15,214 close calls, close proximity events that we found when we had FAA run their own data. It was there.
Recently, I was also there when the NTSB released its findings on the Francis Scott Key Bridge disaster. And in that, NTSB made a point of telling people that you had gone out and looked at other bridges. Following the crash at DCA, have you gone out and looked at other airports to see whether or not this kind of combination exists?
FAA did. We had pushed for FAA to do a review of other airports across the country where helicopters and civilian aircraft around airports came together, and they did a review of all those airports. They still need to conduct a review of the other runways at DCA, at the DCA airport. They looked at it for runway 33, but not for runway 1.
Back in the fall, there was a funding bill in Congress which appeared to reinsert some of the ability of the helicopter flights back into the airspace around DCA. You reacted very strongly to that, and a lot of people said that your reaction quickly fixed that. It's a bit unusual for an NTSB chair to react in that way. What went through your mind when you heard about that, and your reaction, was that a reflection of trying to get their attention to this, or you were just angry about it?
My reaction is, if it's not the NTSB to raise concerns about, if we're not going to do it, then who? I mean, we have, and in this case, this was a provision that allowed for technology in that airspace that existed on that day that would not have communicated to that aircraft, that helicopter was in that airspace. We have a recommendation going back 25 years saying we need better technology. We've put a person, on the moon. We are decades advanced in technology, and technology is available to provide more visibility in our airspace to air crews, to helicopter crews. And why are we reverting back to what existed on January 29th when a terrible tragedy occurred? So if nobody else is going to speak up, that is my duty as the safety chair of this agency to speak up.
Well, it certainly got a lot of people's attention when you said that.
But still needs to be fixed. It's still in the NDAA and still needs to be fixed. Hopefully after our board meeting on Tuesday, they'll take some action.
By the time people see this, those findings will be released, the final report. When people read it, what should they look for? What are you still looking for?
When people read it, well, what I'm looking for is for our recommendations to be implemented. And sometimes we have to repeat our recommendations. You'll see some recommendations in this report that is a repeat and could have prevented tragedy, and we're going to talk about that. But I think what people really need to see, when we look at an accident, we don't see, oh, it's just a helicopter that hit a plane, or it's just human error. That would mean it's dismissive of really the organizational change that needs to occur, the systemic change that needs to occur after a tragedy like this. So it's beyond just somebody's responsibility to see an airplane, or somebody's responsibility to see a helicopter, or somebody in the tower to see better. What we're talking about is system failures. The helicopter route, we're going to look at air traffic control, we're going to look at yes, human performance. We're going to look at the helicopters themselves. We're going to look at very comprehensive issues around this tragedy that occurred to recommend very broad change.
Was there anything that you weren't able to do during the investigative portion immediately in the days after the disaster? Were there difficulties that you ran into?
There were some difficulties with the flight data recorder, but not anything that we weren't able to address, and we actually got those answers later, where there were some problems with the altimeters, and so we were able to, ask some questions about that at the hearing that we had, and there'll be more that comes out about that this coming week.
One of the things you said the morning after disaster, because I watched it again, was that you were going to leave no stone unturned in getting to the bottom of what happened that night. You look back on it a year later, do you feel like all those stones have been overturned? Do you feel like you've gotten to the bottom of what happened?
Absolutely. We left no stone unturned. And now, once we come out with this report and our recommendations, they have to be implemented to make sure this never happens again. That's when safety change occurs.
When you work in news, you meet a lot of people who lose loved ones. And one of the things I always say to them is that nothing can bring back who they've lost, but answers at least will help them cope with what they're dealing with. Do you feel this report will help these families cope with what they're dealing with?
I think that's difficult for me to answer because I imagine I'm a mom. And I imagine if I lost my loved one or her, nothing would help me cope. It would be incredibly devastating. But I would be grateful to have some answers. And it would probably drive me to work towards those solutions. But you would always be suffering the loss of that loved one.
That's understandable. As you look back on it now, in your role when you speak to the American people, is it even possible to assure them that this could never happen again? Or is that just an unknown that you can't give that answer?
I can't give that answer. We issue recommendations that will prevent it from happening again. But those are recommendations. And we have many times issued recommendations where no action was taken, and we end up with another tragedy, and another tragedy, and another tragedy. The first mid-air collision that we recommended collision avoidance systems was in 1968. And so in order to prevent it from happening again, you have to take the action that we tell you to take to prevent that next tragedy.
Chairperson Homendy, we appreciate you taking the time to talk to Fox 5.
Thank you so much for having me.